On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Ben Van Roo. He is the CEO and co-founder of Yurts. We're going to be talking about bringing Gen AI into very secure environments. Obviously, dealing with production and Gen AI are two different things. We're going to be talking about that plumbing. We're going to be talking about, it's not a modeling, but a software question. We're going to be talking about really dealing with Gen AI in highly secure enterprises. I think that's going to be slightly different. Ben's going to tell us a little bit about what that means. And also, he's focusing on something not super sexy, but very important to production Gen AI implementations. Ben, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks a lot for having me, Amir. Appreciate being here.
Absolutely. All right, tell us what Yurts does before we dive into the episode.
Yeah, well, Yurts is a software infrastructure platform. And so what we do and we believe is all of the models, the progress we've seen, obviously in the last couple of years, but really in the last 5, 6, 7 years, natural language processing has been on this arc where the models were getting better, they were pre-trained, they were able to address more and more tasks, but the infrastructure to make them really useful for large enterprises, for secure enterprises, really wasn't there. And so what that means is we like to kind of think of ourselves as sitting in between the users that want to consume Gen AI for everything that's plugged into pre-existing applications, to writing emails, to contract modifications, to idea generation. It's all over the board. We help do is connect those users to the models and artificial intelligence, to all of the data and the roles and the restrictions that exist for an enterprise to really bring that to life. And so we saw this, and I anticipated this challenge about 4 or 5 years ago. We started the company about 2 years ago. We're a Series B company. We recently announced our Series B. We have about 50 people, and we work with some of the most secure enterprises, I would argue, in the world.
Awesome. I mean, definitely, I think a lot to cover here. And I might just switch up the order of questions because I am curious about this as a starting off point. I know 2024 is quoted as the year of POC for AI. 2025 will be the year of production. What are your thoughts on that?
I totally agree. So, I saw this challenge, I would say, circa 2017, 2018, when I was at a company that was bringing some early natural language processing technologies into parts of the government, the Department of Defense, large and secure banks. And this path was moving forward where the models were getting better. In 2022, when we started the company, I knew that the precursor of ChatGPT, the GPT-3s and the other models were all really becoming quite interesting. I had seen some of the proprietary companies and their strategies around bringing all of the data to them. And I kind of just thought, that's not exactly how big companies do it. And we're missing the ability to plug this type of technology into an entire world. And so, interestingly enough, ChatGPT happened about 4 or 5 months after I started the company. And then, obviously the world kind of flipped on its head and we all became familiar with large language models. But that then meant in 23, people wanted to start to get their heads around, like, what does this mean? No one had budget for it at the time, other than people that were really focused on it. And for me, working with the U.S. government, they were one very large organization, but parts of it were really focused on it. But we noticed then in 23 and 24, all of these really interesting open source tools came out for people to play. People were exploring use cases. People were saying like, hey, I can use this tool and an open source model and an open source vector base and kind of kludge it all together. And a data scientist showed, here's a use case that we could explore. And then the rest of 24 happened and people said, all right, now we want to turn this on for our company of 2,000, 5,000, 100,000 people. And bam, everybody hit a wall because all of the boring stuff wasn't being addressed. And when I say boring stuff, which my co-founder and CTO will, hate hearing that's boring, but it's all the architecture around how do you do ingestion, roles-based access control? How are we going to manage all these models at scale? How do we observability? Who's using this stuff? And then there are things that are really interesting. How do we plug these into applications and workflows that exist? By the way, how do we plug this into on-prem environments? Something like 50 to 60% of all the compute at the Fortune 2000 does not exist in the cloud. And so all of these other things started to say like, wow, wait, our CEO wants us to get 20 to 30% productivity gains. It's not plugged into anything that we actually use. And we started to kind of see that, I would say, towards the back half of, 24, which, for companies like ours, we're kind of like, pounding our heads on the table in 22 and 23, like, hey guys, this is coming. But it really meant that we needed a moment for companies to say, where does this fit into what we do? And then the next question was, well, how do we make it happen? And 25 is the year where we've played with ChatGPT or Anthropic or other open source tools. We've tried all these use cases. I was at a aerospace conference and a big contractor had something like 160 internal use cases that they had turned on all these widgets. And then they decided like, oh my God, how do we make this just work? And so that 25 is the year where I think people are really transitioning and maturing into how do we make artificial intelligence, specifically large language models, part of what we do. And that kind of feeds into the buzz of agentic workflows. And we'll see more and more of that. But whether it's just a standard large language model or a reasoning model, some agentic workflow, what I think people are really starting to realize is it doesn't matter until it's connected to the work you do, the data sources you do, and then have all the privacy and considerations around that. And so that's what this year means.
I love it. It's interesting. As you mentioned, people taking some attempt, finding some low-hanging fruit, focusing on some use case. From your perspective, you're seeing these things from the ability, from an infrastructure, the scale, people trying to roll into production. Typically, what have you seen as the bigger gotcha of going, you know what, this has worked at a small scale use case, whatever the audience is, and we want to actually push this out further. What are some of the big gotchas that people just aren't thinking about ahead of time?
There can be big existential kind of architecture gotchas, which could be something like, wait, Anthropic doesn't run on-prem in a data center, let's say. So wait, what are our options there? And it's not to pick on Anthropic, that'd be like an example. So maybe they do or they will, right? That's great. So like, are we architected in any way that we can consume this type of technology? And the answer may be yes or no. And then there could be the infrastructure gotchas at a little bit lower level of just like, how do we make sure that everyone has their data that they use each day available for these models to be consumed for retrieval augmented generation based pipelines, so we can ask questions or search things or engage with it to be, where we don't have to launch out into the ChatGPTs of the world and, remove a customer's name and put it in, and then bring it back, which a lot of people are doing. They're basically just like taking sensitive data, pushing it out in the internet, and then bringing it back. So there's how do we make sure that we can connect to the data that we care about, that we can embed it into the applications we care about? Those are kind of like, those hit people really quickly in the face when they say, well, wait, we isolated it to this one data set, but now we want to have thousands of data sets. The other gotchas that really do come up are companies that say, well, we did a few use cases with a couple really smart ML engineers or data scientists. Can we roll out a software capability at scale to thousands of people? And the data scientists say, like, well, wait a second, I'm not a sustainment software engineer. When this fails in the middle of the night, like I don't want to get up. Like I'm a data scientist. I'm really good with models. I'm really good in that space. And so the people aren't necessarily aligned to, hey, do we want to invest 20, 30, 100, 200, hire them people just to do this? And then, what are our options? What are our actual software interoptions? So it really can range from, what do you even have the environments to enable the use cases that you want to do, to what are the software infrastructure considerations that you need to put in place, to do you have the right people, and does that make sense for you to invest in that? I do see increasingly more and more where there's a realization to say, like, wait, if we have these really talented people that can do this work, and certainly people can hire them, do we want them to do that? Is that core from a strategy standpoint? Do we need to own this technology internally? Sure. Do we need to build it internally, sustain it, update it? And it really starts to, I would argue, very few companies actually need to do that because it's software. And so I'm obviously totally biased, but that's how I think about it.
I love the explanation. I think there's two different areas to go into. One, I want to go back. I want to come back to its software. But before we do, you mentioned, obviously, the boring stuff. The boring stuff also has typically been stuff that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I mean, we could talk about data governance. We could talk about some of the observability stuff, various components that necessarily don't draw the biggest budgets, the biggest attention until something's wrong. With something like Gen AI and moving it to production, is there a reconciliation to, listen, this stuff typically isn't high on your list, but when it comes to this particular technology, you have to address it. Otherwise, there are XYZ problems. Is that happening? Is there truth to that? Or is it a case of just fix what you need for whatever's going in production and just live with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's all this is kind of a moment in time, which, I also try to convince myself when I'm want to move faster, or my investors when we're trying to do certain things, where organizations have to get excited. Then they have to establish baseline use cases. Then they have to kind of think about what the value is. Then when that value is realized, it actually becomes part of the DNA of the company. Then things have to fail. And so, a football analogy, no one cares about your cornerback until they get burned on some long, post pattern, and somebody goes 80 yards for a touchdown, and then that guy's the bad guy, in this, or an offensive lineman that lets a guy through, right? And so there's a little bit of it that mature organizations that are thinking about, okay, we are realizing that this is becoming core to what we do every day. Or maybe it's a nice to have. It might just help you write emails, but it's not actually deciding business critical decision transaction processes where the fidelity of the output has to be, 5 nines or whatever, and it always has to have uptime. As soon as you start moving into the fun to have, into the requirement, and this is how we do business, then the things like observability, data governance, et cetera, then that stuff all kind of goes through, the roof of the importance. For our part, what we kind of took the approach is, for good or for bad, is it all mattered. We were working with very secure environments, mission critical applications, things in the Department of Defense, things in very secure environments for semiconductor organizations, huge engineering national labs. And so for us, for good or for bad, we just kind of had to put our heads down and build this, boring piece of infrastructure from top to bottom, starting in 22, which in some ways is really hard because the world wasn't excited about this in 22 and even 23, outside of some niche groups that really, in some ways, had very, very mature experiences with artificial intelligence. And people ask me often, why work with the DoD on this stuff? And I said, and I have in my career worked a lot with the public sector, but parts of DoD have been thinking about and experimenting and succeeding and failing in artificial intelligence for years. And so some ways they were an extremely mature group of people that had very sophisticated requirements of like, hey, it's got to be hyper secure. It's got to live in all these different hybrid cloud, multi-cloud, or bare metal environments. And they were thinking about data governance. They were thinking about access control. They were thinking about observability. And so we kind of had to just build the all-in-one suite. And so, yeah, I mean, I think you're going to see more and more of the things that don't come top of mind that will naturally come and be increasingly important as these companies mature and make this type of technology critical to what they do, which is like, it's an obvious thing to say, but it's also like, we all got to touch a stove a couple times, hopefully just once, before we really get it. And that's just life. And we'll see that. I think we'll see that in 25 and some in 26 because people will plug them into systems, and then bad stuff will happen, and we'll keep maturing.
That is a great view of this, because I think a lot of people are, and it's fair, we're putting a lot of questions in front of where we're heading and a lot of concerns of dialing in everything. Sometimes I feel we don't know what we don't know yet. We haven't seen enough applications in production. We haven't touched the stove enough times to know, but also everyone feels there's such a liability, such a ethics component, such a security issue that we need to be ahead of all those because maybe we haven't in the past. When you're thinking about your analogy of we're going to have to stumble before we figure this thing out, when it comes to some of those pieces where they are harder, they're more functional when it comes to security ethics, some of those governance, some of those pieces, how far do you need to be ahead of production? Meaning, or the question rather is if you've got it figured out to a certain level and you're rolling something out and you're guiding your users that this is where we're at with this and let's get out it to be used, is that enough? Or are you afraid if something goes wrong, adoption will fall on its face and then it's going to be hard to recover? And that's kind of a multi-part question, but just generally curious your thoughts there.
So I think the 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, natural language adoption of natural language process-based technologies had to be really well trained and tuned, and the models weren't there. And the risk of adoption and falling on its face was substantially higher than it is now. Now, even in the last year, the education that I have to give folks is not about, oh, you should go and try ChatGPT or other ones. It's really more of like why the infrastructure required to enable this type of technology is important, which again is the boring stuff, but people are like, okay, I've used it enough to see where it can be useful for me. And now how do we plug it into all that we do? So I worry a little bit less about adoption falling flat on its face and people kind of going the other directions. What I'd also say is, I spent a decent amount of my time in Washington and engaged various degrees of stakeholders and staffers, et cetera, talking about how they think about legislation in AI. I think thinking about the extreme risks of artificial intelligence, super intelligence, I get it, and it's fair to think about what might be, and I think there's a lot of good people thinking about that. But what I do think is sometimes lost is how much good it can do today with the workforce that we have today, whether it's in the commercial world or even the public sector. You're talking about millions of people that in general have way more data being created each day, archived, sitting in various repositories, an aging workforce that's just rotating out. And people just can't access this stuff. Their internal knowledge, being able to mobilize and action, the institutional knowledge that they have, their corporate memory is atrocious. And so there's a little bit of that. I try to temper people's fears with, cool, we can spend a lot of time having really bright researchers think about what might be the ethics considerations, the concerns, and also things are kind of crappy today. So why don't we start to walk into that space and maybe we can meet in the middle over the next few years? And so what I do recommend is I think the state of agentic workflows and agents in general, reasoning models are nascent and promising, but that's the type of stuff where I wouldn't let an agent loose on every single facet of our company today. But even in our case, the way that we think about it is, how do we use these types of agents and even reasoning models and kind of advanced tools to start to establish first pass greenfield workflows that are important? And then what are the types of processes and steps do we do to harden and make them more tactical, consistent, programmatic? And so, and I think there's a frontier space that we all still should continue to feel comfortable pushing, because I just don't think, I'm personally, not convinced that we're at this pure AGI moment, but we are at a moment where stuff is pretty junky in corporate America and in the public sector. And we can make a lot of gains there. And so I don't know. I try to be pretty pragmatic around like, yes, we can think about the robots taking over the world, but like no one can find and navigate their SharePoint. Which is also like, it's boring, but actually like that's how can we make those people 5, 10, 15% more happy, effective in what they do. And I focus a lot on that.
I love it. You and I have similar thoughts. And I do want to get into highly secure enterprises. Before I do, I just a follow-up question, because I am curious. I've asked this question before. It was somebody who actually worked at an enterprise technology department, so a little bit more difficult for them to answer. My question was, you mentioned on-premise. We still have the concept digital transformation still happening. People are still, quote unquote, migrating to digital, going to the cloud, which after 20 years, you figure that would at some point come to fruition. We now have this concept of Gen AI. I sometimes have a hard time reconciling that these same people that were, these companies that were struggling with digital transformation are going to leapfrog into some AI technologies, which they could. Maybe they kind of short circuit some of that process. I could see that as well. But also I look at some of the cultural things within a company that need to change for them to actually move faster to take advantage of what's coming up before it becomes hey, this is the AI transformation that's taken us 20 years. Do you think that's going to speed up? Do you think we'll see a mirroring of what's happened in digital transformation, or is this too big to not want to get caught behind?
Yeah, so big disclaimer. I mean, in some ways, I'd argue I bet my company on it. In that, I have a great slide of basically every single like mainframe technology through today. And at one point when I was an intern, I worked on some old legacy IBM mainframe technologies as a QA engineer. And so, I think it's somewhere between 50 to 70% of compute for most Fortune 500, Fortune 2000 transactions still exists in data centers on bare metal. So I would argue that, to me, that's the opportunity, because so much of this memory and the actions when we talk about agents, it lives over there. And so on the one hand, for us to achieve the economic gains at a corporate or a national level, we have to go into those modernization efforts, those systems, those legacy systems that exist. And that is the only way that you're going to achieve gains. There's only so much that you can get out of improving people's emails or summarizing people's product meeting notes, which are all important, and we do all those things, but you have to kind of push that way. And similarly, I think, when you look at the efforts of those applications, in some cases it was like, to what end? We're going to consolidate these systems and put all this data together so we can have a better knowledge management tool that's essentially Wikipedia that someone has to then go update and re-enter new information. And that was like, those efforts were in some ways doomed to fail because it wasn't necessarily driving real economic change and productivity gains that I think people hope to see. I think that the other big challenges in a lot of those IT modernization efforts is the systems were really hard to get to talk to each other. So think of like circa the 360-degree view of a customer, how hard that actually was to implement. And so what I do believe is promising, and we've spent a lot of time thinking and working on these types of things, is, well, okay, you have an Oracle database system and an old legacy CRM system. Can we figure out how to get those things to kind of talk together a little bit? And arguably, large language models, the advancements in CPU-based language models, all that stuff is advanced such that attacking those problems is a lot easier. The automatic updates of records of people, better search, all that stuff is drastically changed in the world of large language models. The number of pointing and clicking UI interfaces we have of the tools from circa the 90s to early 2000s, vis-a-vis legacy versions of SAP, it was impossible to navigate those things for all the good reasons. Those systems of records were just really hard. Whereas now you plug into those and you can say, I'm a normal human and I'm just going to ask some questions, and you can start to engage with it in a way that's much more natural. So, again, I'm biased, but I really do believe that we're at a moment where a lot of those modernization efforts and digital transformation can really like now come to life and start to realize substantial benefits. The barriers that they're facing, frankly, are the boring plumbing, infrastructure, access control, doing all those things. And so, that's where we think like what's boring is really cool, is because you're locking up years and decades of transactions, corporate memory, the ability to take action and do certain types of activities within a corporation, and they're just sitting there. And so that's what we think a very, very exciting, challenging part of bringing AI into production is going in 25, 26, and 27.
I love it. A final question, because I did want to ask you this, because I think if it fits your background, you'd be good to answer. When it comes to highly secure enterprises, and obviously government can be one, semiconductor companies that really have a lot to stand to lose if their information gets out. Not that other companies don't, but there's some that are more highly secure than others. When we're looking at AI and prediction at those companies, and we've talked about some of the boring stuff, we talked about some of the challenges of going in production, enterprise compute still majorities on premise. When you look at some of those highly secure enterprises, what do they have to do? What are some of the challenges that are unique to them?
I mean, I think, you touched on one, which is kind of buy-in, adoption, change management. They have to have the right types of people that are going to say, no, look, we got to tackle a few of these use cases. We have to understand the ROI of them. We have to connect them to these systems. And that's just like, people are still going to drive some of that. And I think the art of the possible feels a lot more real than it did 5, 6, 7 years ago with Gen AI. And so I think those are unique challenges. There's obvious stuff like you got to buy GPUs. And not all these models are CPU based for sure. Most are not. And depending on the task, you can kind of err into how you allocate GPUs and deal with that. But there is a like, hey man, we've got to think about this, or we have to find the right types of vendors that can help us. And as proud as I am of what we're doing, I would argue like we're one of a very few companies that are actually thinking about this problem and tackling it. And so, if not us, please call us. But if not us, like you only have a few options to really kind of go and try to make this a real thing. And so it's going to take people time, patience, hiring to build that out. So, hardware considerations is one, finding the right types of partners is two, and then obviously finding the right champions. And so in some ways, that's enterprise software, which I've been around for a long time, so we know that. But I think those are the kind of the main standard unique ones. I think then it's going to get more weird and interesting when the models get pretty good and you start talking about agents. What do we let them do? What do we let them not do? How do we, to what end does this augment our business, and what benefits does it give us? What existential risks do we face? That stuff to me is a few years down the line at least. But getting going is going to be probably the biggest, most unique challenge for corporate cultures in highly secure environments, finding the right partners, finding the right champions. And like that's what companies are going to get their heads around this year and in the next few years.
I appreciate you being on the show. I think we probably could go like another hour to 5 and you'd still have all the insights to tap into, but you got to get back to running your company. I do appreciate your time. If somebody does want to, reach out to you, follow up, maybe learn a little bit more about something you mentioned, maybe learn about Yurts, what's a good way of connecting with you guys?
Yeah, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. They can also, that's probably the fastest, easiest way. Can also share, or hit you up and I can share my email as well. But happy to connect and see if we can be helpful. And even, to the extent that there's a lot of buzz, we do take a fair amount of calls and just try to cut through noise, whether or not we're the right type of solution, just say like, this is the landscape. And I really just encourage listeners to think about the ways that they want to get started. And if we can be helpful, please feel free to reach out.
Awesome, man. I appreciate it. We'll put some of those links in the show notes. Again, thanks for being on. I appreciate your time. That's it for this episode. Be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. One, I think when we think about Gen AI and where we're at, where we're going to be, obviously lots going to change. And I think Ben highlighted a lot of interesting components. I love the analogy of you're going to have to fall down to learn through this process. There's no way you're going to do it perfect out the gate. So you got to start some point. There's a lot of factors that Ben covered in terms of going into production, dealing with scale, being in a highly secure enterprise, and how you kind of manage some of those factors. Please reach out to Ben if you do have a follow-up. Also, like, subscribe, comment, let me know how the show is going for you. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.